Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm the startup investor in the future of work. And we love having guests with us here who have some connection to our team. And in this case, some connection to our team and some deep expertise too. So Maryanne is the founder and CEO of C3 Talent Strategies. She works with teams on executive coaching, HR advice, leadership, and a whole other range of areas. And in addition to that, or as part of that, I guess I'd say, she works as a coach on Sounding Board, which is a company that we backed and works directly with one of the most critical members of the Bloomberg Beta team. So Maryanne, I'm grateful for that. And the question that we have today is, how can I learn to trust my team more? It feels like I struggle with this. Team, please close your ears. But struggle with this as myself as a manager. So would love to hear any and all thoughts, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the warm introduction. I'm delighted to be here saying get to meet you. This is great. I would honestly say it's been an age-old question, right? And like you mentioned, you started with it when you were a young manager. I did too. And it's evolved over the years. But the pandemic really changed the equation for us. And what's happened is when we moved to this virtual world, management by walking around went extinct. So for the faulty leadership practices of just making sure we have a butt in a seat, didn't really work anymore.
Right.
And those bad behaviors got exasperated in the virtual world. And we saw a lot of micromanagement come back because we just didn't trust. And we weren't confident that people were actually doing their jobs. I think one of the most prolific changes that will come out of the pandemic in terms of leadership is our ability to give agency to our workforce. Trust that they're getting the work done, let them decide how, when, and where they're going to get it done, and measure the results, not the methods, right? So we can really focus on that. There's one story in my book about a colleague of a friend of mine, John, who used to refer to it as his Friday smackdowns from his boss. So when they're in the office, not that it was ever okay, but it was tolerable, right? It was at a closed door. His boss would micromanage him, berate him on Fridays. Did you get your stuff done? Blah, blah, blah. Well, then we moved to the virtual world. And so here's John sitting one afternoon on a Friday, going through this meeting with his boss, getting his usual Friday smackdown, except this time his wife and two teenage boys are in the background. And they overheard the whole thing. And he turned around and saw the look on their face. And it was a defining moment for him. 2 weeks later, he resigned. He was like, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
Why would I put up with that? And he really began to question, why did I put up with that all these years? Right. And so the trust thing really becomes a skill and a will. I think a lot of times leaders don't trust because they don't have the skills, right? Like they're relying on management by walking around, which didn't work. So they relied on bad old behaviors. But, thinking about how you can measure productivity, that all changed in the pandemic. I like to think about starting with positive intent, that we actually believe they're doing their jobs, and unless you prove me otherwise. And one of the things we talk about in the book, two skill areas, progress over perfection. Relinquishing some of that control is a skill we need to develop. And so when you do that as leader, you learn to trust because you're giving some, control over the work to them and let them get that done. The other one is around how we send signals in what we say and what we don't say, and how people can read into that and see through that, right?
And by the way, the book, which I don't think I mentioned, is The Office is Dead, right?
Yes, The Office is Dead. Now what?
I'm not sure, by the way, that I fully sitting here in the office and valuing face-to-face. I'm not 100% sure that I'm there on the premise of the book, but I do think for certain occupations and in certain organizations, for sure, that's true. And it's certainly a lot less central than it once was, even 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. And to be clear, what I really mean by that is the office as we knew it.
I love that.
It will never be the same.
Yes, 100% true.
It will never be the same.
100% true. It sort of reminds me of that, the king is dead, long live the king kind of thing. It's sort of like the office is dead, but it's alive in a new way. So can I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
When you think about the cases for managers, you mentioned some of it is the skill that they've just got to practice these new ways of of relinquishing control and trusting. What do you see as the appropriate cases? Managers have a lot of fear about trusting, right? Fear something won't be done right, or fear that that some damage will be caused to the activities of the organization or something. There are many valid fears. What are the right limitations on trust for a manager?
I'm going to offer you another example, a story from development. And this shows up in two places. One is what we call humans at work. So it's really starting there, that we know we're working with a human being and not a widget and not a number. But it's also a mindset reset. And so the story goes in chapter 3 about a workshop that I did for a group of independent agents. I grew up in the property casualty insurance space, so I still do a lot of work there. And we were having a workshop on finding hidden talent, because the insurance industry has been suffering from finding talent for decades, right? It's nothing new.
As investors in an insurance brokerage, we definitely have seen that firsthand, or secondhand, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, for sure. But we did this workshop on how they find hidden talent, and the issue of hybrid obviously came up. These agents were baffled by why people wouldn't want to stay in an office, right? They were so accustomed to, that was their business model. It's how it works. And one agent offered up a software product that he bought to track keystrokes. So he could monitor and manage who was actually working and who wasn't.
Eek.
Right? Even worse, he never told his employees that he installed that software. It ran silently in the background. So it was interesting because another agent chimed in and said, well, we bought the same software, but for a very different reason. She said, because what I noticed was my employees were working late hours. They were working on weekends when they didn't normally work on weekends. They were working extra hours into the night, and she was afraid of burnout. And she said,
wow. So the opposite was to stop them from working.
Right. And she told them she implemented this system so she could recognize when people were actually sneaking in on a Saturday to do something that she didn't want them doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the difference,
to be fair, if trust includes letting the person work the way they want to work.
Correct. But she was just trying to prevent them from their own, ills of working too much, because that's the downside of the hybrid world, right?
Sure.
People are working much longer hours. But the point is, you can see the two different mindsets. Same software product does the same function, but implemented in very different ways for different reasons.
Yeah.
And so the agency where he did it in the background, never told anybody, he couldn't keep talent to save his life.
Sure, of course.
But the other one was actually doing pretty darn good.
Let me come back to the question, which is, what are the appropriate limitations on trust? Because I'm not sure if I get that from that story.
Yeah, well, the appropriate limitations, I think, is what you keyed into and how you use that software, right? You shouldn't do it just to do it. You should do it for a purpose. And that's depending on that degree of trust you want to have and you want to share, right? So you let people know where you're at and why you're monitoring, right? So the monitoring piece is where the trust plays and lays, and how you use it, how often you use it, and for what purpose you use it plays right into that trust. The other thing that happened for her is she built loyalty, because now she deepened that relationship, which we know is a key foundation of trust.
Yeah, what it brings up for me, and I'm curious how you think about this, is I think that there's a powerful way in which trust happens kind of in certain lanes, meaning, you trust somebody on how they're going to get their work done, for example. Yes. I mean, and for me as a manager, that's an easy one. Like, I don't feel any desire to manage the way somebody gets something done as long as they get it done. But I've also had the word thrown back in my face as a manager, where it's like, we're writing something, a past job, but we're writing something that's going to go in a press release. And my quote is in the press release, my name. And the person says, we should write it this way. And I'm like, no, I would like to write it this way because. And they say, well, why don't you trust me? And the there's an aspect of it which is let's predict who is likely to be right about what the effect is, and you can choose to trust the person. Or there's an aspect which is like, no, as the leader of the organization, I need to sign my name on the dotted line on some of this. So it's not a trust question. It's just if we're wrong, I'm the one who has to,
You're
eat
going to hold the
the
bag.
consequence
Yeah,
of it. And
sure.
so I don't think there's any such thing in any relationship as sort of like unlimited trust in every way. But I do think that most managers, especially early managers, would benefit from trusting much more. That, by the way, the common failure mode I see is they're overly worried about costless mistakes.
Yes.
It's like, if somebody messes up on an internal presentation, it might be a little embarrassing, but depending on what the presentation is, maybe it's not the biggest deal. And people kind of need to have the opportunity to err in order to learn. Right. And so figuring out sort of what's the lane where you can trust them to err in a way where they'll learn and you can grow as an organization. To me, like that's the question, is sort of where to direct it. And anyway, so that's just what it brings up for me.
You're spot on, right? It's the degree of risk you're willing to take. It's the amount of failure you're willing to allow to happen, right? But there's also, another thing that I heard you describe but didn't explicitly say is setting your expectations, right? And so if you're very clear about where those lanes are, like in your case, and the final say is mine, period. That's just the way it works. And everybody has to adjust for that. But when you're explicit about those things and it's clear, then people can stay in that lane and you can develop the trust relationship over time.
Yeah, I love that. Let me ask one more question, which is, now let's turn the table and make it from the employee's perspective, or the person's perspective. They're not necessarily an employee. They could be a contractor or something, where you feel insufficiently trusted by the person whose job it is to oversee your work. So you gave the example of the person who was getting the crap beat out of them every Friday and eventually they quit. My hope is that they did that after escalating through some various attempts to try other things. And I'm curious, if somebody's feeling insufficiently trusted, what are some things they can try?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is you have to be willing to have that conversation, right? And you have to be able to name it, explain why, give some examples, and then try to invite them into a conversation like we've been talking about. Let me try.
Yeah.
Give me some guide rails, set me up with a mentor, if whatever the concerns are, to be able to address that.
Yeah.
Right? And for the individual who's feeling that there is no trust, what they're looking at is, what is that relationship with my leader?
Yeah.
Right? And does that need some help? Because that's where it all starts. And, if the leader isn't willing to listen or isn't willing to try, then you become in a contentious relationship and it doesn't work.
I think that's so well put. And I've found that, people using, very classic nonviolent communication techniques of I language for talking about, I feel, whatever, ... And, to me, the most productive kind of conversation can be the honesty of, I trust you to do this.
Right.
I don't trust you to do that because, and that's okay. Like, a person has to be able to hear that stuff. But I think that it is, it's as we renegotiate all these implicit understandings of how manager fears were addressed about whether somebody was getting their job done.
That's right.
And, by the way, some of those fears are valid. I mean, I heard a story about somebody who, accidentally discovered that one of their star employees was another company's star employee as well.
I've had that.
I'm sure.
I've actually had that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, sometimes the fears are valid. And I think that saying that they're not isn't right either. It's a question of how you manage them together as a duo, if you will, or as a team.
That's exactly right. And my biggest approach, the thing that I love the most in leaders, employees, and contractors and everybody, is to take an approach of questioning, right?
Curiosity.
If I'm that employee and I'm not feeling like I'm being trusted and I'm not getting assignments that I think would help me grow, a great question to ask their leader might be, what would it take for you to let me work on that assignment, right? And it just opens the door for a non-judgmental question that invites to have a dialogue about what's going on here.
Yeah, my coach recommended this thing to me that I could ask somebody sometime where I felt like under-recognized for something, underappreciated. Ask the person, when you think somebody's doing a good job, how do you appreciate them?
There you go.
and then let them talk about that,
That's
kind
right.
of that kind of thing. So I love
Yeah.
that. I wish I practiced this as often as I talk about it, but
Yeah.
one of my former bosses used this line, curious before furious,
Oh, I love it.
which stuck in my
That is cool.
brain. Rhymes are good for that. All
Yeah.
right, Maryanne, anything else you want to share before we
Yeah.
drop?
Because we like this notion of questions, I would just share that that's really how the book is written. It's written from the lens of a coach because we were front row seat to everything that went on in the pandemic.
Sure. Coaches were the frontline workers of the office place.
Yeah, it's really a field guide to help leaders, executives, human resource leaders kind of work our way through this to a better place. Let's not go back to the way it was. Let's just move forward and bring all these lessons with us.
I love that. So the book is The Office is Dead. And Maryanne, thank you for your work in general and in particular with the Bloomberg Beta team. We benefit from that enormously. And for those folks who are here for the first time, the reason we say this is not advice is because we don't know what you should do in your situation. Maryanne's sharing the stories of what she's seen, perspectives on things, and ultimately you're the one who needs to decide. So thank you and would welcome you back and to be continued.
Thanks for having me, Roy. Great to meet you.
That was fun.
Take good care.